Welcome. Can people hear me? Great. Thank you. So my name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And welcome to the virtual reading group. Today we are continuing just the second session to read the first section of Hannah Arendt's last unfinished book, The Life of the Mind. And I just want to, before I jump in, introduce Samantha Hill, Assistant Director of the Center, who's on this call, and she'll be leading some of the sessions. And since we have a number of new people, I thought I'd introduce her. Samantha, can you say hello?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the virtual reading group. Looking forward to talking about thinking.
Great. So thanks, Samantha, and we'll try and both be on as many of these as we can. It's the summer and we're both traveling a lot, so we'll do our best. So I want to. This is a difficult book, and it's also not your typical Arendt book in that it's about the life of the mind. And so much of her work is about the real world, the commonsensical world, the world of action, the world of appearance, and that all comes into this book. We can see her thinking. But I just want to back up a little bit and remind ourselves some of the things we talked about last class very briefly, last session. The first thing that I want us to remember is that Hannah Arendt's not a philosopher. And we talked a little bit about this last time. It's really an important point. She's interested in the world, not necessarily a tradition of ideas, the history of being in the Heideggerian sense. She says she comes to this book through for two reasons. One, in her encounter with Adolf Eichmann, and she saw him as thoughtless, and she asks the question, could the activity of thinking condition against evil? And in many ways, this first section of The Life of the Mind on thinking is about that exactly. What is thinking? What is the activity of thinking? And that's what we have to keep reminding ourselves that she's asking. What is this activity of thinking that may or not be able to condition ourselves against doing of evil? The second reason she turns to this question is that in the human condition, her first, big book. I mean, not her first big. Her first big book was The Origins of Totalitarianism. Her first foray into a general book on what it is to be human as a condition, not an essence. She focuses on action, and she, in a way, brackets off contemplation and thinking. And then at the end of the book, she quotes Cato via Cicero, who says, never is a man more active than when he does nothing. And she sort of leaves it at that. And she is now returning to that question. She refers to this book in her Denktagebuch, in her notes, as volume 2 of the human condition. And so it's important to understand that, this is sort of the sequel, unfinished as it is. She thinks all of us have the ability to think, have the inclination and ability to think beyond our knowledge. And this is a key distinction, the distinction between thinking and knowing, or thinking and cognition, that we're going to continue to encounter in this book. And she develops this as a distinction between, in Immanuel Kant's work, between Verstand and Vernunft. Verstand is cognition, or the intellect. Intellect aims at truth, and it seeks to know things. Whereas Vernunft, a translation of the Greek nous, is not about knowing things and finding their truth. It's about thinking and discovering their meaning. And that's really the core of this book. She writes, the need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. when I read a book, or certainly a book by Hannah Arendt, but any great thinker, I want to find like the core sentence that I'm gonna keep coming back to as I read the book, and help me try and understand it. That's the sentence, right? The need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And if after the 6 or 7 sessions that we will be together for reading this book, you can begin to explore and understand what that question means, I think you'll have learned a lot. I hope. The last thing I want to say by way of this introduction, again, somewhat of a summary, but I hope moving us forward, is that if we're interested in the quest for meaning, and the quest for meaning is found not in knowledge, not in understanding or cognition, but in thinking, one of the absolute core problems is that thinking is invisible. Seen from the perspective of appearances, the main character of mental activities, she says, is their invisibility. So what we have is this problem that we want to explore the quest for meaning, which happens through thinking, but thinking is invisible. How do we think about this invisible thing called thinking? What is it? How do we know it? And how can we nurture this invisible activity in other people in such a way that it may or may not condition them against evil? That is, I think, a question she's asking. Let me, in a way, that's somewhat review, but it's also, I think, more. Let me stop there. Are there questions about anything I've just said? I mean, because that's really a big, meaty thing before I sort of go into the more specific passages that I want us to read for today.
I'll jump in for a second and just add to some of the things that you said, Roger. So you started by saying that Arendt's not a philosopher, and she certainly doesn't importantly, she doesn't understand herself to be doing the work of philosophy, but this is, I think, importantly, especially we see this in the passages we read for today, I would say Arendt's most philosophical work. She was trained within the tradition of German philosophy. And where you ended talking about, thinking about the question of how does thinking appear, if thinking always deals with invisibles and happens within the invisible realm of thinking. For Arendt, she's really drawing us to the tradition of phenomenology here. And she's approaching this question of metaphysics and being, of the relation between body and soul, through a phenomenological frame, thinking about our appearance in the world. And so I would just add that it's important to not throw the philosophy out the window, because I think it's important to the framework of what Arendt is doing in the life of the mind.
Yeah, so Samantha and I are going to really disagree here. And that's fine. I don't think you can understand this book if you read it as a book of philosophy. I just don't think it is. I think it's. I mean, again, we can have an argument about what philosophy is. But for her, she says in the introduction that it seems like a philosophical question, but she says it's not. She says philosophy begins in the gap between words and thinking, the world of appearances. Between the gap between words and thinking on the one hand and the world of appearances. And philosophy prefers thinking or ideas to the world. And so in that way, it's a counter philosophy. And it's meant not to do what philosophy does, as she understands philosophy, which is to
I think
elevate ideas and concepts over the world of common sense and appearance. It's an attempt to recapture the value of the surface, the value of the apparent and the apparent, and that's a big part of what the book is. So, I mean, again, we can argue about what philosophy is. I don't want to have a deep argument about it, but I think it is important from my reading of the book to see that she's arguing against the philosophical approach. So
when you had that discussion,
I don't.
oh, go ahead, Sam. Go ahead, Sam.
I was just gonna say I don't think the disagreement I don't think our disagreement is that great, Roger. I just don't. Arendt is engaging here with serious questions of metaphysics and phenomenology, and she says that she considers herself to be doing the work of joining the ranks of those who understand themselves to be dismantling metaphysics. And so I'm not saying that she understands herself to be, writing a systematic book of philosophy. She's very much not doing that, and she is intentionally pushing against that kind of philosophical work. But at the same time, we have to be attentive to the traditional questions of the concept of metaphysics while reading this book if we want to understand what Arendt is doing.
When you had the discussion in the last session about philosophy, not philosopher, I took it one way of interpreting her claim of not being a philosopher is that she did not want to be held to the standards of a philosopher in her writings. Not that she did not want to have somebody check off this is what philosophers are. That's all I took it to be.
Well, thanks, Patrick. I don't think she's worried about standards in the sense that I think she's pretty confident in what she's doing. Again, we can have all sorts of interpretations. I've offered one, which is that she sees philosophy, as Samantha said, she was trained by certain philosophers. She grew up in the school of Husserl, Heidegger, and Jaspers, kind of phenomenological school. She certainly read the philosophers very carefully. And given her training and given her reading of philosophy, she is of the belief that philosophy is a particular discipline of the human sciences, Geisteswissenschaften in German, and that it is governed by certain guiding questions. What is being? What is truth? And how to and in being guided by those questions, even for someone like Immanuel Kant, who she finds to be deeply attuned to the limits of reason and the limits of philosophy. The critical philosophies he wrote were for her incredibly important. But even for someone like Kant, he is captured by the traditional philosophy to the extent that he accepts the philosophical hierarchy of truth and ideas over surface and appearance. And even Portman, who she offers as the counterexample, is at times captured by that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But so for her, the claim not to be a philosopher, is not a claim. Is not simply a claim of rhetoric, and it's not simply a claim of don't hold me to these standards. It's a claim of I am actively opposing what philosophy has been, and I'm doing so not in the name of philosophy. I'm not interested in the philosophical question of what is truth. I'm doing so in the question of what is meaning and what is thinking as an activity that is engaged with meaning rather than truth. And that to me is the question of the book, question we have to struggle with. It is a question of someone like Heidegger turned his thinking towards. Heidegger also refused to be called a philosopher for whether you believe him or not. A lot of people think it was rhetorical, but I don't. I think it was actually deeply essential to his understanding of what he was doing, trying to escape the philosophical tradition. And so Arendt is also in that line. Are there other comments on any of that, or should we move on? I mean, I'm very happy to continue with this because these are important preliminary ways of understanding this.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
How, when she does her introduction and or discusses these various philosophers, how deeply do you think she completely understands the philosophies that she's analyzing and presenting here as sort of the groundwork? Does she completely, she says she's not a philosopher. Yeah, maybe, well, I just wanted to say, how much do you think she understands and really gets it? Is she totally into it, or is she just hasn't even really looked at it that deeply?
Okay, great question, Ken. So Hannah Arendt studied with Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers. I mean, two of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. She was a great reader on her own right. When you say, does she understand them? Does she understand Immanuel Kant? She has one of the most profound readings of Immanuel Kant you will ever encounter. It's not your standard reading in all of its ways that you will get if you take an intro to philosophy course, or even a Kant course. She understands exactly what the intro to philosophy of Kant says. She's going to disagree with some of it. And so in the third part of this book, The Life of the Mind, which was never finished, but which we have lecture notes for, is supposed to be a section on judgment. So book 1 is on thinking, book 2 is on will, book 3 is on judgment. And she makes a claim that for Kant, judgment is a political activity based in the spectatorial, apparent claim of creating a sensus communis through the judgment of examples. She will say, this is not exactly what Kant thought he was doing. He didn't quite understand the depth of his own work, but this is what he was really doing, right? She gets Kant, and she knows Kant as well as any philosopher of the 20th century. There are a couple of pure Kantians, but she really got Kant. Her reading of Kant is the kind of reading of a philosopher that seeks to take the essence of him and make him better than what he said. And some people will be bothered by that, and some people will think that's genius. But you can rely on her when she's talking about what these philosophers say. When she says, well, what he really meant was, that's when you want to say, okay, well, she's making a controversial interpretation. And she usually makes that distinction. Okay? Any other?
Can I just add to that quickly to
Samantha, do you want to go on? Just keep it brief, yeah.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I wasn't sure if Susan's go. I just want to add to that and say, I just want to emphasize what you were saying at the beginning, Roger, which is that, Arendt's claim not to be a philosopher is a political claim. But that claim doesn't mean that she's not engaging with the questions of philosophy. She is intentionally breaking with the tradition of the philosophical tradition that she emerged out of, studying with Heidegger, Husserl, and Jaspers in the tradition of German idealism, at a certain historical moment in time. She says the burning of the Reichstag showed her that she could no longer do philosophy, that she had to do political thinking. And so she understands her work to be worldly in that way and constellated around political questions. One of the early versions of thinking that she gave was her essay, which we have now on thinking and moral propositions. And that, that was delivered for the first time at the annual conference for existential and phenomenological philosophy. But she sees herself in making this claim to be making an intervention and turning against the tradition. But do not be mistaken, she's not only reading Kant once, twice, but, we have her library here at Bard, and she's reading Kant in translation in German, going back over and over and over, intensely reading these works, and her readings might not be orthodox, but I don't see that as a bad thing necessarily. It's one of the ways in which Arendt is an original thinker.
Any other comments or questions? Quick. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought I heard you say a few minutes ago that Arendt was looking at thinking as in some way an antidote to the evil that she saw in Eichmann. And yet, I remember from last time, she also says thinking most of the time is politically useless. So it feels like that's a contradiction, and maybe I'm not hearing it right. So
yeah. So thank you, Susan. I mean, again, we'll get into this later in the book, but I'll give you a preview. The key word in what you just said is thinking most of the time is useless. Not all the time. And this is sort of the problem for her, is that most of the time thinking is useless. And so we don't make an effort to cultivate it in everybody because we think it's mostly useless and mostly a waste of time. It has no appearance. I mean, this is why this appearance is so important to us. Thinking does not appear in the world. But there's one exception to that in her account, which is that in times of emergency, so in times of totalitarianism, when everyone, she says, is unthinkingly swept up in an ideology, in a movement, whether it's the environmental movement or whether it's the Nazi movement, doesn't really matter to her. When everybody becomes part of a movement and they don't think, they just act. Those who think, now, what is thinking? We're going to get into that, but it's something like stopping and thinking. It's something like having a conversation and being self-critical, and thus not embracing the movement in an uncritical way. Those who stop and think hold themselves back, and in holding themselves back, become visible in their refusal to go along with the movement. And it is in that moment that thinking becomes visible and becomes a political act, politically meaningful act, insofar as it makes other people who then have to confront the thinker who stops and doesn't participate and ask, well, what do they know that I don't know? And it begins the process of questioning. It's going to be more complicated than that, obviously. We're going to get there in 200 pages. But that's the basics of it. Most of the time, thinking is useless. It is invisible. It doesn't appear in the world. But there will be exceptions that become very important. And that you can see the problem, Susan, which is that if most of the time it's useless, it's very easy to simply give up on thinking. And that's what she thinks most of us do. We stop the hard work of thinking because it doesn't give us much. And yet the result is that then when we need it in times of emergency, we're not habituated to it. And a lot of her work today is that, a lot of her work, when she wrote it, is, in a lot of her more essayistic writing, especially in two books like Between Past and Future and The Crises of the Republic, are what she calls exercises in thinking. And she says we need to exercise ourselves in thinking today because we've lost the habit of it. For so long, we depended on tradition to give us what we wanted. For most people, we've forgotten how to think, most of us. And we need to reteach ourselves. And that's what a lot of her essays are an attempt to do.
Roger?
Yeah.
In response to Susan's question, a reminder that she begins this book by quoting Heidegger, 4 ways in which thinking does not do things, but the last of them is thinking does not endow us directly with the power to act. So there is that word directly. When I read that, I took that as what this book is essentially about, knowing what she was thinking about acting from the human condition.
Yeah, I mean, the actual Heidegger quote, which is from Was heißt denken, what is called thinking. Das Denken führt zu keinem Wissen wie die Wissenschaften. The thinking leads to no knowledge as do the sciences. Das Denken bringt keine nutzbare Lebensweisheit. The thinking does not bring any useful life wisdom. Das Denken löst keine Welträtsel. It doesn't solve any worldly puzzles. And das Denken verleiht unmittelbar keine Kräfte zum Handeln. It doesn't lend or give to us any immediate power to act. So these are this is the citation of Heidegger's, and as you just said, Jack, no immediate power to act. But that quote from Heidegger is obviously one of the inspirations for much of the book, clearly. I'm going to get to Howard's question in a second, but I'm going to first go through a little bit of the text in the chat box. And by the way, for those of you who are new, you can either ask questions verbally, and you're welcome to. Or you can also write them in the chat function on your right of your screen, and we'll get to them there, however you prefer to ask. So the first 2 chapters, which we talked about last week, again, I'm going to very briefly say the first one is the world's phenomenal nature. And the key, there's 2 keys here, or 3. The first is that the world is a plural world. It has spectators, and nothing appears in the singular. This is a very important idea of Arendt's. So the world is an appearing world, and to appear you need others. The second is that living beings have an urge to self-display, to appear to others. But the problem is that thinking withdraws from the world. It bends back upon the self, she says. And so the question she raises in this first chapter of the book on thinking is, how does thinking and other invisible activities appear in the world? Or do they? And I already gave an answer, somewhat of an answer to that through Susan, but that's what this is going to all be about. And then in the second chapter on true being and mere appearances, we get into a fundamental paradox that is going to run through this whole first section between being and appearance, and between Verstand and Vernunft, between intellect and reason, between truth and meaning. The point is that philosophy and science both, and she reads philosophy and science as part of the same anti-worldly drive, they seek truth behind appearances. And that's not wrong in the sense that the appearances are sometimes deceptive and there is a truth behind them. But they then, both science and philosophy, elevate truth above appearance. And that's what she calls the metaphysical fallacy, which is why science is metaphysical for her and for Heidegger. It sets the cause above the truth and the idea above the real world. And so that's the and yet it also, if it's smart science, recognizes that man is an apparent being. He lives in the real world of appearances, and that's a paradox. And that's what begins chapter 3, the reversal of the metaphysical hierarchy, the value of the surface, which was the first chapter we were reading for today. She begins with a discussion of science and progress, that science seeks progress. It seeks to disillusion us, die Entsäuberung der Welt, in Max Weber's terms. It seeks to take away the illusions, the mysticisms, and bring us to truth. But the first problem is that science never reaches a final truth. I mean, every stage of science is another hypothesis that we take as true, and then we realize some point down the road that there was a limitation to that, and we're going to get further truth. And in fact, she says, if we were ever to get to the truth, science would never be able to stop, because its entire premise is that there is no truth. Because you always have to seek below the truth. And yet science thinks you have to find the truth. And there's a paradox in that. There's also a paradox in that science seeks to elevate the hidden and the ideal, and yet the scientists themselves live in a real and apparent world. There's going to be a critique of the scientist then, insofar as the scientist attacks the meaningfulness of the apparent world, the world we live in, and seeks to create a fake world, a true world that will replace it. And that's a dangerous idea, because it's an attack on reality, and it can never be fully carried through in a world in which most people have a reality sense without a dangerous and potentially violent and terroristic attack on human individuality and variability. And so there is a deeply dangerous drive in the scientific desire to elevate a hidden and ideal truth over the real. Now, let me be very clear. This is not to say that science is totalitarian, but it is to say that all totalitarianism is pseudoscientific. One of the main points she makes in the origins of totalitarianism sections on totalitarianism is that totalitarianism is always ideological, and therefore it could not exist before the scientific age. Because what it says is that there is a logos, a truth of an idea that is so true that even when it doesn't fit with the apparent facts, it's still true, and what we have to do is deny the facts in order to protect the truth of our ideology. And what she says is an ideology, therefore, can't exist without science, but it is a pseudoscience, because science seeks to find the truth behind facts, and when it finds a discrepancy between the truth and facts, it has a problem. Whereas ideology, when it hits that discrepancy between truth and facts, seeks to actually erase the facts that are the problem and create the true world in the world of ideology. Science responds to this predicament and this difference between the ideal world and the real world, generally with functionalism. Now, again, this is this could be, one could easily say to Arendt, this is a reductive view of science. Not all science is functional, and I think she would clearly accept that. There are certainly scientists who move beyond reductionism and functionalism, and yet the basic idea here is that whenever you have appearances, a multitude of facts, what's meaningful is not the appearances, the facts. It's the laws, it's the rules, it's the laws that unite them and make them true, and give them a function and set them within a purposeful framework. And that's what science seeks to do. And she then, in this chapter, and this is a very important chapter for this reason, it's one of the most interesting chapters and texts that Arendt ever wrote, chapter 3 here, on the reversal of the metaphysical hierarchy, the value of surface. She turns to a biologist named Adolf Portmann. He wrote basically from the 30s to the 70s in the 20th century. And his main book, and he has a couple, but in The Beauty of Butterflies in 1936, he's intrigued by what he calls the phenomenon of variety. And he says that against functionalism, which asks, what purpose does beauty serve? So you all know butterflies. I mean, I don't know how many, but there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of different species of butterfly. And they have beautiful different wing structures and things. And he says, functionalism says, well, what purpose does the beauty serve? Does it help for reproduction? Does it help for keeping, the survival of the species? What does it do? How does beauty and variety serve in an evolutionary development? That's what he asks in The Beauty of Butterflies. Well, what he says is, against the functionalism, there's simply another way to look at the beauty of butterflies, which is that they respond to the desire to appear. And if you look at nature, he says, whether it's butterflies or Mediterranean sea turtles or tulips, all living things have a desire to appear. And in 1968, writing in her Denktagebuch, this is about the time when she starts to read Portman, so about 6 or 7 years before she's writing this book, Life of the Mind. She says in an entry in 1968, regarding Volume 2 of the Human Condition, all that lives strives to appear. See Portman. All functions show themselves, but not the silent dialogue of thinking, not the will, and also not judgment. They are without necessarily coming into appearance. And so, Volume 2 of the Human Condition that she's working on or thinking about already in 1968, all that lives strives to appear. See Portman. All functions show themselves, but not the silent dialogue of thinking. Thinking is this one thing that doesn't show itself. And we need to ask, therefore, what is this activity of thinking? On page 27 in The Life of the Mind, she says that individuals and species have functions, but these functions are only meaningful in the context of appearing and self-display. So it's not wrong to think that our organs and our bodies and everything we do serve some function, have some functionalism. And if we're interested in the question of truth, of intellect, of cognition, we can pursue those. But if we're interested in the question of meaning, that will only be encountered in the context of appearing and self-display. Now, I think you have to ask why. Why is it that meaning is not in truth, but only in appearance and self-display? And one answer is that meaning is not something that can be reduced to intellect, to knowledge. Meaning is less apparent than that, or less knowing than that. What is the quest for meaning, right? I mean, that's really what's going on here. One way to think about it is that she says that there's an innate impulse to self-display. Everything wants to appear. Everything alive wants to appear. And in self-display, I make my presence felt, seen, heard. I make my presence felt. To me, that's another key point in this book. And it goes back, or I connect it with a number of places in Arendt where she says that, well, for example, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she says that the only truly human right is the right to be meaningful, the right to act and appear in public in ways that matter, is what she says. And here she says, make my presence felt, seen, and heard. It is to appear in a way that people say, oh, you exist, you matter. We have to take you seriously. That's not about, self-preservation, or that's not about me being a living being. It's not about me being part of an environmental movement or part of a biological or zoological or sociological world. It's about me, Roger Berkowitz. Why do I matter? I sit here and I talk to you. You guys listen to me, and I make my presence felt. And it can be me, and it can be a farmer who walks down the street and people take note of him or her. It can be anyone. The point is, it's when we appear and are seen in ways that self-display and make our presence seen, felt, and heard. That's when we matter. And she says on page 27, these functions are only meaningful in the context of appearing and self-display. You can't be meaningful as part of a sociological analysis that says that all men today or all people today are seeking are on Facebook and therefore lonely or whatever. Yeah, I mean, that tells us something about humanity, and it tells us something about the sociological way people are today, but it doesn't provide meaning to any of us. It may be true, but it's not meaningful. And this is what she takes. I mean, again, someone asked the question, I think Ken earlier, is she a good reader of these texts? Well, here's Portman, a biologist. She's certainly not a biologist. And she'll say over and over again in her analysis of Portman, well, he doesn't really see the implications of what he's saying. She's reading him in her way. And that's something she does brilliantly. But he was clearly pushing against the standard biological functionalism and saying there's another way to think these things. And she's pulling on it and saying this connects with thinking and meaning and appearance. So, let me stop there for a moment. Are there any direct questions to this chapter 3 and then I'm going to start taking some of the questions in the chat, and then we'll do questions 4 and 5, chapters 4 and 5, which we read for today as well.
Roger?
Yeah.
I'm
going to get to your questions soon, so okay.
That's okay. There's no rush. But this maybe relates to it. Because when you talk about meaning and appearing, that can't happen in a vacuum. It's relational. In other words, you have to appear to someone or something or some phenomena. And when you talk about meaning, that also is something it's a shared phenomena. And so I guess that's what I was trying to talk about when I asked my question.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, which is why chapter 1 on the world's phenomenal nature begins with this claim that we live in amidst a plurality, and nothing happens without spectators. Nothing can appear in the singular. Thus, if you want to extrapolate from that, there is no sovereign subject. There is no individual. Against Descartes, and here goes to your question, there's no way to guarantee reality through self-consciousness. There is no reality without plurality, without a world that already precedes us and will outlast us. And so she, I'll read your question because it now goes to it. Howard Wright, he wrote a question. I understand the human very differently than Arendt. I actually wonder if that's the case. I think you're quite with her. I do not see either the inner unchangeable soul or appearances. In fact, I do not see Descartes' dualism. I see an integrated whole without borders or content, immersed and or imbricated in constantly changing situations that consist of multiple vectors, some perceived, some not, some controllable, others beyond human power or influence. My understanding is the result of how I read Deleuze and Connolly and the anthropologist, who I don't know, Jared Zeno. So, I mean, again, Arendt is rejecting a Cartesian dualism, and yet the Cartesian dualism is, so to one extent, real, insofar as it has become part of a philosophical tradition that does in some way accord with reality. So, I mean, here's maybe where you and she will disagree, Howard, I don't know. But she thinks it is the case that there are appearances, right? We see the sun rise. And yet we also know now that the sun doesn't move. We move around the sun. So there's an appearance and there's a truth. And that difference is real. It's phenomenologically real. And therefore, the dualism of a mind that seeks the truth behind the appearances and the appearances is a real part of our reality. Where she disagrees with Plato and Descartes is not in that difference, but in the valuation, in the hierarchy, in the setting up of the idea as higher than the phenomena. Is that so? I don't know. Howard, you say you see an unchangeable, you see integrated whole without borders or content, immersed and or imbricated in constantly changing situations. I mean, I'm not entirely sure I understand what that means, but there's a whole, but there's also individuals. I see, there's you and there's me, and we're obviously related through this weird thing called the internet on a computer screen today. But we each are in our own place and we have certain differences. And there's also how I look and what I'm saying and the surface here. And yet who knows what's under that surface? And there's a lot of different ways you can begin to peel that back, and I hope you don't. But they can be biological, they can be psychological, they can be medical, they can be philosophical, and there's a lot of ways that we can understand that duality, but without setting one side higher than the other. That's her point. Jack writes, despite some small differences, I share Howard's view. I don't arrive there through neuroscience, although I find some correspondence in current research. By that view, I assume you to mean something like the idea of a oneness. I don't know, but
yeah, that's right. An integrated the person, the individual being, is an integrated whole, but totally
yeah. I mean, you guys know that by now. There's going to be a way that Arendt is going to be scared of any integrated whole, because as soon as you start talking about science, there's a great line. I wrote it. Where did I write it down? There's a great line that she has. Actually, I think it's a line from Portman that she notes, where he says, "The abundance of facts hinders us seeing them as we look for general rules and laws and functions, and we overlook facts." To me, that's profoundly, meaningfully Arendt. there's trillions and trillions and quadrillions of facts and of people and individuals and surfaces. And science and philosophy seek to find the rules that govern them, and then overlook the individuals and the facts. And so much of Arendt's work is a pushback against the privileging of rules and generalities over individuals and variability and opinions. I mean, so much of her political work, as we've talked about many times in this session, is about privileging opinion over truth. And again, here in her philosophy, she's trying to privilege surface and variety over cognition and intellect and truth.
I don't think I made myself clear, and I don't want to take the time to do that because that's how I look at the world, and right now we're looking at how Hannah Arendt looks at the world. But I do have a question, which is when she takes on Portman and talks about an inherent desire to display, somehow the individual organism wants to display. To me, that's metaphysics. That's where that goes. That's something that she, in other ways, rejects, and I don't know where that comes from. Where is? I really understand what she's trying to say about display, and it really fits into the way I think about things. But I don't think of it as though there were a desire, as if there is a drive to do that, because I think that's probably it's probably a necessary condition for the way she thinks about thinking. So I'm a little puzzled by it, and maybe I don't want to take up a lot of time with it, but maybe you could clarify that a little, or Samantha or somebody could take on this innate desire to display.
Yeah, she calls it an innate desire or innate impulse to self-display, Selbstdarstellung.
Self-display, yes.
What? Yeah. Everything alive wants to appear. So Portman sees this as a biologist, right? He says everything alive wants to appear. He says, look, if you look at creatures, if you look at living creatures, from Mediterranean sea snails to butterflies to anything, they don't just want to procreate and live. They want to be seen. They want to be beautiful. They want to show themselves. And you can't deny that in his view. There's a deep desire to display. Now, he sees that in all animals. And we're only in chapter 3, Jack, so let's give her a break.
Okay.
But in chapters 4 and 5, she's going to turn away from that, right? I hope we saw that. And she's going to, especially in chapter 5, re-engage this question of self-presentation, Selbstdarstellung, and make it human instead of zoological. Mm-hmm. And in making it human instead of zoologically, she's going to say that for humans, as opposed to butterflies, so far as we know, there is a choice in our self-presentation and our Selbstdarstellung. All humans choose how to present themselves in the world. But we don't have a choice of whether to or not, in the sense that we all do it in some way or not every time. But how we do it is going to be a choice, more so than likely a butterfly or a sea snail. has that choice. And so we're going to get into that in chapter 5. If you want, we could go straight to it. But maybe I should do chapter 4 first.
Okay, I can wait with this. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I think I haven't made myself clear, which is that she does. You're right. She does now progress to the presentation of the self, which her thinking about that is based on a belief that has to do with something inner, something
Yeah.
something, if you like, ineffable on
Jack,
the inside.
can I try and answer your question? So I think, Jack, I hear you picking up on something that I've always wrestled with in this book on thinking, which is a kind of paradox that I read in the way Arendt is addressing this metaphysical question of true being and mere appearance, because she wants to do away with the transcendental claim of metaphysics that there is a truth, that there's a more genuine, more real being, right, that exists. But at the same time, she's retaining the language of metaphysics. And so what we get is the idea that that people can appear in more authentic or inauthentic ways. But for Arendt, it's not transcendental, it's worldly, and it's conditioned by plurality and the fact that by our very appearance on the earth and in the world, that we appear before one another. And I think that creates a kind of tension in thinking here. What you're saying about desire, and what I read her in part to be doing in this section, which I think will becomes a little more clear in 4 and 5, is she's critiquing the tradition of Western political philosophy. She's using Portman here to critique Descartes and to also critique Hegel, who I think she has one little sentence about. But Hegel, who in his phenomenology of spirit defines self-consciousness, the thinking activity, as desire, roots that in this kind of otherworldly realm. And Arendt is intentionally pushing against that, thinking about how our being in the world is conditioned by appearance. And so when she's talking about desire, that's also part of her critique then of Descartes, who, as Roger was, talking about in science and, claims to authority or truth, removes us from the world in a way. The other thing that Descartes is doing is turning us away from our senses, turning us away from trusting our own individual experience of the world. So when Arendt's reading Portman in appearance and saying everything that can feel wants to be touched, everything that can see wants to be seen, everything that can hear wants to hear, she's reclaiming the senses as a kind of willing activity, which comes out more, I think, in the second book, which we'll do later on in the fall. So I hope that, I don't know if that helps a little, but maybe.
Great. I'm just going to answer one question that's relevant right here, or two. Nancy asks, isn't this setting appearance higher? I don't think it's setting it higher. It's trying to set it at least on equal footing. She says appearance is primary even for metaphysics. It comes first. But that's not the same as higher. I think appearance is going to be more important in this book because we're interested in the question of thinking. And insofar as it's a book on thinking, it's going to be a book on it's going to be a book not on truth. And as a result, it's not going to be a book about the ideal or the true. I don't take there necessarily to be a claim of higher and lower in that, although we can, as we go through it, continue to interrogate that as we do.
She's echoing the human condition there, too.
Yeah.
Where
Good.
she says she doesn't want to create a hierarchy. She wants to put them on equal footing.
All right, I'm gonna go on just for a second to chapter 4 and 5 because I want to make sure we get them in the next half hour, and then I'm going to come back to your questions. So 4 is body and soul, soul and mind. The key distinctions here, as I understand it, I'm going to try and be somewhat quick here, is between mind and soul on the one hand, and on the one hand, let's just look at mind for a second. These are going to be important distinctions for us to remember. Mind, metaphors allow mind to have a sensible appearance. So when you and part of the issue is here that when you think in words. You can't. I mean, this is a point she's going to make later again, but you can't think outside of words. I mean, it's a fascinating claim and one that I'd love to hear people's thoughts on. But can you think about something without putting it in, words? Can you think about a unicorn without thinking unicorn? Can you think about anything outside of the words and the world we live in? But she says, no, we always are in words already. We're already in a world and with metaphors. On the other hand, the soul is a weird thing because she connects the soul with passions and anger and emotions, and conceptual language is inadequate to the intensity which is expressed in a glance or sound or a gesture. And so she makes this distinction between the passions of the soul and the thoughts of the mind, if you want to put it in that way. I think I can put it in that way. Thinking, the thoughts of the mind can be without a body. There can be no sensations to them. Whereas the passions can't be active without a body. You can't be anger without anger showing in some way in your body. The passions, she says, are the same for all. Anger is anger. Ugliness or beauty is ugliness. The inner organs, have the same function for all of us. Lust is a sexual urge which is universal. Fear is needed to survive. We all have these things, and they're the same. There's fear is fear, lust is lust, for everyone. But love, as opposed to lust, is infinitely variable. And courage, as opposed to fear, is a decision not to show fear. And so there's this distinction she makes between the thoughts of the mind and the passions of the soul. And again, which one is she more interested in? Well, mostly in thinking here, so the thoughts of the mind. And this is going to be the transition to chapter 5, in which he says that courage is a choice. Love is a choice. Yeah, we all have lust and we all have fear, but when we turn from our passions to our thinking, we make choices, and it's a thoughtful decision. And in making such a choice, and in making such a thoughtful decision, we lie. We create a semblance. We present ourselves in a particular way, which is not the same as our inner passions. So when we say, I love you, however we say it and to whomever we say it, we are, in some sense, dissembling from lust in a way that's meaningful. But it's not. It's a semblance. It's a way of presenting ourselves. And so then the question is, do we continue to present ourselves as loving or courageous in a way that's consistent and lasts through time, at which point our semblance takes on the form of a character and becomes what she'll call an authentic semblance, what she'll also call an unavoidable illusion. So if you act courageously continually, or you act as a lover continually and not as a lustful person or not as fearful, eventually that semblance will become an authentic illusion or authentic semblance, which will also be an unavoidable illusion. And it will become part of your character and who you are. And this brings us to the chapter 5, which is on appearance and semblance, in which he says that what appears may be mere semblance on page 37, but that mere semblance doesn't have to be mere. It can also be an authentic semblance. And it is an authentic semblance to the extent that it becomes in some meaningful way unavoidable and inherent. There's more to say, but I think that is the crux of the matter. So let me, before I'm going to start going through the questions in a second, but are there any immediate questions to what I just said? Sam, do you want to respond or say something? No,
I think there's
we don't
quite a
have
few
to.
questions that popped up in the chat box while you were talking. So,
Okay, so
maybe we should just look at those and go from there if you want to scroll
I'm
down.
not Ken. It's
Because
perhaps a
I don't
technical
know any
question.
of people can.
Yeah. Perhaps a technical question, but does the mental process of dreaming show itself, at least to ourselves? She's actually going to talk about dreaming, I think, in the next chapter, or soon. So we will come back to that. Yeah, on page 43 and 44, she's going to talk about dreaming. But dreaming clearly is a way of thinking. It's in words, and therefore a kind of mental thinking, mental activity, but one that is unconscious to some degree. And so does dreaming, does the mental process of dreaming show itself to ourselves? Well, yes, insofar as it's in words, but again, it shows that the words show itself. I mean, what's behind them does not. So we'll come back to that. That's going to be chapter 6 that we'll talk about that in for next time. Carolyn asks on page 42, if we trust only our experiences with appearing and non-appearing things, if the divine is what causes appearances and does not appear itself, then man's inner organs could turn out to be his true divinity. I love her humor. Yeah. We look at that's on page 42. Oh, I see. It's at the bottom of the continued paragraph on 42. Let me read the whole thing so that we can get it. If we trust only our experiences with appearing and non-appearing things and start speculating on the same lines, we can just as well, actually, with much stronger plausibility, conclude that there may indeed exist a fundamental ground behind an appearing world, but that this ground's chief and even sole significance lies in its effects, that is, in what it causes to appear, rather than its sheer creativity. If the divine is what causes appearances and does not appear itself, then man's inner organs could turn out to be his true divinities. Yeah, so it's a nice, humorous, ironic line. The premise here is that why privilege the being over the appearance? I think you've nailed it, so we can go on. Susan writes, there's a certain irony in Hannah Arendt's apparent disinterest or opposition to psychoanalysis, since she's interested in the individual and the particular versus the generalities, the rules, the norm. No. Well, I mean, again, I think that's she raises this question in some of these pages about depth psychoanalysis. I mean, to the extent that psychoanalysis seeks to find rules for interpreting inner processes, it is a science, and it focuses on the the intellectual cognition of internal invisible processes, um, and to that extent ignores, or if not ignores, at least reduces in importance the apparent uh, uh, aspects of our being, the variety. It reduces us to types, to diagnoses, um, to different rules. So that's her. That's a big part of her critique. My screen just went blank. I hope you guys can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
That's a big part of
I guess
critique.
for me, the difference is that that idea of norms and rules is more a function, is more characteristic of psychology than real psychoanalysis, which is really about listening for the particular, you know, the symbols and the meaning for the individual. So maybe it's just a question of I don't know enough about her view or her understanding of
Well,
psychoanalysis.
Susan, let me just respond, and you tell me if this makes sense. Even psychoanalysis, while it listens to an individual, the whole premise of it is that it's not listening to what the individual is saying, but what is hidden and not expressed in what they're saying. And so the premise of psychoanalysis, at least if I understand psychoanalysis correctly, is that, like a good scientist, you're looking behind the words and the dreams that appear to the hidden truths that
Mm.
psychoanalytic science can reveal.
I mean, I think this is probably going to get us off on a tangent because, I mean, I think that, you know, Freudian psychoanalysis practiced correctly is really listening for the meaning that the person in analysis ascribes to the words that she's using. You know, what is the
Mm-hmm.
meaning for her? Not what is the meaning for all of us or most of us, or what should be the meaning, but the particular meanings for that individual of both events in her life or the words that she uses. I mean, it's all about words, basically. It's about
Right.
your language and
Okay.
what
I
that
mean,
language. So
Arendt
anyway,
may have
just
had a
slowly.
Arendt may have had a slightly different view of,
Yeah,
I mean, what psychoanalysis was. I mean, Freud, as you know, called himself a scientist and
I
thought
know.
what he was doing was deeply scientific. And I
People,
think
I think, now think of it more as an art.
okay. Well, she might be more open to that aspect of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But when she's criticizing psychoanalysis, she's criticizing the Freudian approach in that sense, or at least that's one aspect of her critique. Margaret writes, I'm confused by a seeming irony in the notion of inherent self-display. This was a question I think Jack brought up or someone brought up. That is, when people choose self-display as non-unique, say a soldier, for example. So I think I hope I explained this, Margaret, but basically humans, while they may have an urge to self-display, they have a choice in how they display themselves. And in every act of self-display, there's some concealing and some revealing. So in your example of a soldier, let's just take a courageous soldier, a soldier who acts courageously conceals her fear and reveals her courage. But her courage is not true. It's a surface. It's something she's presenting to the world. And her fear is also not true, but it is something that everyone has, and therefore has an inner truth to it that a psychologist can discover. And so, from an Arendtian point of view, there is a choice there. There's an impulse to display, but how we display is one we choose. Is that now clear, Margaret, or there still a confusion?
So that
I do have an additional sort of side to it, which is when the whole point of the choice is used in information, not so much the actions of an individual soldier, but I mean, negatively Klansman or say a Nazi, or perhaps I worked in the corporate world a lot. Not supposed to stand out. There's a uniform that you wear. You're supposed to look like everybody else. And it's supposed to be non-individuating. That's kind of the, and so I'm wondering how that comports. Is one self-displaying precisely as a part of a community and therefore non-individuated, or am I off on a tangent?
Yeah, so I mean, you can the choice you make to self-display can be have multiple motives, right? It doesn't have to have only one motive. You can display yourself as a Muslim or a Jew because you're raised in a culture in which values that, and you want to honor or affirm that culture, or you don't care and you just do it to avoid any trouble. But you can also choose to reject that self-appearance and be a rebel. So you can choose your choice of self-display can be conformist, or it can be non-conformist, and many places in between. I don't think there's just one motive for how we display ourselves.
So, Roger, that's what I mean when I talk about being immersed in a situation. We present ourselves, the soldier presents himself in whatever the situation is. The lover expresses themselves in what the situation is. Who they are at that moment in that situation is neither false or not false. That's who they are. And in another situation, they be something else. And that's what I was trying to get put into words.
Yeah, I think that's right. What she would say is, you can present yourself in a conformist way, as all soldiers do, but you can also be unique and present yourself as a deviant or a rebel or a resistor. And these are choices that we make. And to the extent we are consistent with our choices and carry them out over time, we will be seen to have a certain character that, in the old Socratic sense, is our daemon, and we become known for being courageous or cowardly or honorable or not honorable, and that is a semblance, but it can also be an authentic semblance. But if we are not consistent in our character, then that semblance will be seen to be hypocritical, and it's always hypocritical to some degree because it's always a semblance. But sometimes it will be seen to be hypocritical more than others. Ken writes, when she says that courage is a choice, I feel like she's doing the analysis with her end argument in mind. Okay. I mean, on the one hand, I would say, don't we all, and isn't that how you argue? But I'm not sure Ken why
what I
that's.
meant, what I think that I meant was, I feel like as if she's trying to establish a bunch of facts and then create her theory or argument or whatever after these facts have been sort of like looked at in a, I don't know, fair scientific kind of way. But on the other hand, to say, where is the fact? How do you show that fear is sort of a more fundamental, true expression than courage? I mean,
Okay, well, I mean, there's part of the answer here is that she's actually using the analysis of Aristotle between fear and courage, and so you can but I mean, and so I guess you could question that and say, well, isn't courage an emotion or a passion? Aristotle says courage is a choice to reject fear, which is a natural passion. Uh,
that's
we could.
exactly kind of
What?
Yeah, sorry. That's exactly what I was trying to get at.
Yeah.
I don't disagree. I do agree that yes, we could certainly express our outer selves differently than what we are feeling. But on
So
the
I
other
mean,
hand, just stating
we
a bunch
could.
of stuff as fact.
I mean, I guess what I would say to you is, it strikes me that fear is a universal. Everybody is fear. I mean, unless there may be a couple people with like brain damage that don't get afraid of things. But I don't know anybody who's not afraid. I know many people who aren't courageous. And it does strike me that courage is less of a universally human passion than fear, which is what I take to be her point. Yeah, Sam?
It might be worth recalling. It might be worth recalling the passage in The Human Condition where she says that courage is the political virtue par excellence because courage, it requires courage to appear in the public sphere. And she's associating courage with appearance in the human condition, and specifically how we disclose ourselves to one another in public, in a space of public appearance, through word and deed, which she quotes here in this last section as well. She talks about how we distinguish ourselves in word and deed. So I don't think that she's understanding courage, as I think Roger was saying, the philosophical framework of Aristotle, as a virtue, and not as something that belongs to the private realm. That's one of the ways that she actually revolts against Christian morality and the human condition as well. She thinks that courageous acts are always public in character.
Yeah. That's what. Just one last thing. So that's what sort of bothered me slightly was that I know that I felt like, and I haven't read this before, I felt like the argument was going to come later that yes, courage is this result of thinking, and it's this good thing. But first, she's saying now that it's not in a sense, it's not as innate as fear is. And we're just using this one example, fear and courage. But I just felt like, how do you know that? So anyway, that's all I wanted to put out.
Yeah,
there.
I mean, let me say, how do you know it? I mean, this is what psychologists and biologists and sociologists study, right? And I'm sure, I think most psychologists would say fear is sort of a universal human passion. My guess is that most don't think courage is. We can have that. I'd love to have that discussion. Some of we teach, the Hannah Arendt Center sponsors a whole program called The Courage to Be, which explores the idea of courage. One of the things that we constantly ask is, what is courage, and how does one cultivate it? But the premise of it is that courage is something that has to be cultivated, whereas fear is not something you have to cultivate. it's much more natural, at least as I understand it, and I think that's how she understands it. Connell Fanning writes, words or the language as they are written or spoken do not seem to play any role in my mechanism of thought. Oh, this is, I think he's quoting Arendt. Words or the language as they are written or spoken do not seem to play a role in my mechanism of thought. The psychical entities which seem to serve as elements in thought are certain signs and more or less clear images which can be voluntary, reproduced, and combined. Einstein. Oh, this is a quote of Einstein's, I was going to say. Yeah, well, I think Arendt would disagree with this. For her, words and language, you can't think outside of words and language and spatial and physical metaphors. Now, one thing I'll add is that mathematics is a language. And if you think in mathematical symbols, that's also thinking in a language for her. So when Einstein says, written words, the language as they are written or spoken do not seem to play any role in his thought. The psychical entities that seem to serve as elements in thought are certain signs and more or less clear images. Well, I mean, that would be okay with Arendt. That would fit with what she's saying, because insofar as you're talking about signs and symbols and images, you're talking about the world, and that the language and that your thinking is taking place in a worldly element. What she's saying is you can't think in a way that's completely outside of the world.
And music as well?
What?
And music as well?
Music, too, would be a language. I mean, for her, I mean, the question is, what does music express? That's the old Schopenhauer question. But certainly the musical notes are part of a language. But to the extent that music is, I mean, there's going to be a question of whether music is an act of thinking or an act of passion, and there may be different kinds of music, and then it would be different.
I like that answer.
Okay, I'm glad to give you answers you like. Sometimes I also like to push you a little bit. Come on. It is interesting that passions are associated with the soul. What about the spiritual dimension of the soul? This is the idea of a different view of the duality of the human experience, Joanne asks. The soul is not necessarily understood in the way Arendt is presenting it. It seems to me passion is also an experience of thinking. I wonder if the soul in reading Arendt is actually the center of being. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. And in fact, this is one of the questions Martin Heidegger asks in his work that for some reason Arendt doesn't really pick up on. At least I don't remember her doing it. Maybe she does in the willing section. But Heidegger in his work begins to ask whether thinking itself is a passion, and whether you can separate thinking from an emotion, and whether there's always an emotion in thinking. He argues there is, that you can't think of a thinking outside of an emotion. I think it's a good point. I think for Arendt, what's important is not the absolute distinction, but the distinction between an inside and an outside. That even if thought is to contain some passion and not be as passionless and therefore emotiveless as Arendt is suggesting, there is in thought an invisibility that there is not in, at least a more invisibility, or more with a stronger withdrawal from the world than there is in passions. And I think that's convincing. I don't know if you do, Johan. You wanna respond to that, Johanna? I'm going to go on because we're running out of time, actually almost out of time. The idea of semblance, Frank writes, is a choice that when repeated can become our real self. Seems to me to be reminiscent of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Does this seem plausible? Yeah, she's talking about Aristotle here. So I think it's deeply plausible. I mean, Aristotle is a huge source for her on this distinction between passion and thinking, and therefore self-presentation. So I think seeing that makes a lot of sense. Jason says, I find myself in conflict on the topic of thinking. Is within the purview of words. Okay, so is thinking within the purview of words? From Schenck, 1991, I agree that we think in a narrative mode. Every sentence has a beginning, middle, and result. Architects are trained to think in images and to solve problems in an imagined three-dimensional space, sometimes four. Perhaps this is just thinking in different patterns. Right. So this is relating to the question I answered earlier about Einstein. Again, there's not, when we say language, we don't mean English or German or Chinese necessarily. Actually, in a couple of chapters, I forget which chapter, she's going to talk about Chinese, and we're going to read about how Chinese speakers speak in language, and it's going to be different than because it's not just Chinese. I mean, all pictographical languages, and so we're going to get into that question directly, Jason. But the point is that there are not all languages are Indo-European grammatical languages. And math is a language, music can be a language, space architecture can be a language. Her point is not that you have to speak in one of the particular Romance or other languages, but you have to speak in a world, and through metaphors. You're not just coming up with it sui generis. Angel writes, hi Angel, I understand courage as an invitation to act, a principle from the outer world that inspires us to appear for a greater cause. That's how I understand Arendt's notion of courage. Courage is not primarily internal. I think that's exactly right. I mean, this goes back to Ken's question about courage. She sees courage as an idea that inspires us and allows us to deny our fear, not as a universal passion. And Nancy, and I'll end on this because it looks cute. It looks deep. Sorry. Is painting, drawing a language like music? I would have to say, I mean, again, just like there's different kinds of music, there's different kinds of painting. But yes, I think painting is responding to and articulating and arguing with and engaging with a tradition and a world. So I think that there's definitely a language of painting. It's just as there's a language of music.
That pertains for me to the question of whether in dreams some people think in images, and I'm still finding it a little confusing, her notion of language.
Yeah, well, we're going to get much more into it in the chapters on, I guess, in the next section, when we start talking about metaphors and the ineffable. So these are chapters 12, 13, and 14, and so we're going to get much more into these questions, Nancy, and I hope in those sections we'll be able to clarify things. Okay, we're out of time right now, so I'm gonna let you all go. But this is tough. Look, this is tough stuff. I mean, even though I've made this argument, she's not a philosopher. this is tough stuff, and it's not as easy as some of her more it's not as graspable as some of her more political essays. So I'm thrilled you're all staying with us. It will continue to get easier as we read more of it. I hope you continue. We're going to meet next week. You know, often we meet every 2 weeks, but because of scheduling things, and I'm flying to Europe soon, I'm actually flying to Europe at 6 o'clock next Friday, and we're going to meet from 1 to 3 next Friday, and then I'm going to run to the airport. So we'll meet next Friday, and we'll send out the reading. I think we're finishing. Are we finishing this first section on appearance? I believe so.
We're doing the thinking
So, yeah,
ego
we should
and the
probably
self
read through
on
page
Kant,
65. What?
and truth and meaning, and Kant's distinction between intellect and reason.
Okay. Well, we'll send out the.
Roger, one quick question.
Yeah. What?
Where in Europe are you headed to?
Oh, I'm going to be teaching in Italy. I'm actually teaching this book in Italy at something called the Collegium Phenomenologicum. So good to see you all. Keep reading Arendt, and we'll see you next week in 1 week. Take care.